So I want to talk a little bit about the role of geography in shaping how states think about their security and kind of predisposing them to viewing other countries as potential allies or potential adversaries. And we'll talk about this in a couple ways. I'll just start, at the very beginning by thinking about the shape that countries hold, their physical shape, and how that can create or exacerbate or mitigate different security perceptions. So we talked in an earlier conversation about how the sort of relatively narrowness of Pakistan created a perception that Pakistan versus India lacks strategic depth. That if Pakistan invades India, it can get in, 100, 150 miles before India is able to launch a counteroffensive and respond. But if India invades Pakistan, it could easily overrun Pakistan because of the narrowness of the Pakistani state, and that exacerbates Pakistan's sense of vulnerability relative to India, and has led Pakistan to sort of pursue this idea of strategic depth through control over Afghanistan. Shape of the border can also affect this. A concave border, I think concave is like that. If you're attacking in order to get to the north of that border, you have to go the long way around. If you want to go to the south, you have to go the long way around. But if you're defending that kind of a shape, you can park your forces in the center and respond as needed. And so one place where we're seeing this is in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where they're attacking along a concave border and have to shuffle forces between the east and the south and the north, where Ukraine can potentially respond in whatever direction is needed. So it increases the potential for defending that territory or complicating attacking. Another example where we see the shape of a country sort of affecting the challenge of invasion is when you have kind of a conical shape. And so I'll give you two examples of this. When Napoleon or Hitler invades Russia, initially the invasion works reasonably well, but every mile of territory that you take, because of the sort of conical shape of Russia's territory, the front that you have to hold and advance along gets longer and longer and longer, and so the challenge of holding that becomes more difficult, and at some point you reach sort of a point where you're too spread out and vulnerable to a counterattack. And that's just sort of built in with the logistics and the challenge of the geography. And any military trying to invade Russia from the west is going to struggle with that exact same challenge. Another place where we might see that kind of a dynamic would be with Mexico, where if the United States were to move south against Mexico, initially the border is quite long. And that's a significant sort of chunk of territory to hold. But advancing south, the front line would shrink because of the nature of that territory, making it potentially an easier invasion route, not because of anything other than the way that the continents happen to be arranged. And so it kind of gives a sense of how threat perception might be related to this. It might also be a function of the actual physical geography, not just sort of the shape of the continents or the border. It can be difficult to project force across rough terrain, mountains, extended deserts. And different type of equipment is going to be useful in different types of environments, right? So a flat terrain may be ideal for tanks or for maneuver warfare. A dense jungle is not going to be useful for maneuver warfare. You may need to think about, the mud that comes with snow melt, or you may need to think about how snow impacts whether mountain passes are open. The physical geography dictates a lot of the nature of how warfare gets fought. But it's also the political geography around it, right? So where are the actual borders? And some countries are positioned in such a way that they're hard to get to without the cooperation of their neighbors. And so Afghanistan is one of these examples where it would just be very difficult to be able to access Afghanistan or to sustain any sort of military force in Afghanistan without the cooperation of Pakistan. And in fact, cooperation with Pakistan was a prerequisite before the United States could effectively attack Afghanistan after September 11th. Other cases where this has come up in 1994 with the Rwandan genocide, it proved to be very difficult to get forces into Rwanda Rwanda is a landlocked country. It requires sort of coordinating with a variety of different forces. The forces that do arrive eventually, sort of as the genocide is winding down, are French forces, and they have to get there by marching overland through Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, just because of the inaccessibility of getting to Rwanda, having to pass through other countries' territories. A third way that sort of social scientists have thought about how geography shapes force projection is this idea of the stopping power of water, which gets attributed to John Mearsheimer, who notes that fundamentally different types of militaries are needed when you project force across land versus when you project force across water. And if you have, the world's greatest land army and they're marching, unopposed across huge swaths of territory, it doesn't matter how powerful or overwhelming that military is. When it reaches the shore, it essentially has to stop. And if it's going to go any further, it's going to have to retool and advance with a different mode with sea power. And because of this, you can think about countries as maybe land powers or island powers, where they think about their security, they think about their risk of invasion, either in terms of, I expect sort of overland attack, and therefore I need to prepare myself to fight off that kind of overland attack, right? Develop my own military, develop defensive lines, or I perceive myself in terms of attack from the sea, that I expect to be attacked in that way, and therefore I'm going to build myself up militarily to defend against an attack from sea. So submarines that can patrol the coasts, maybe aircraft carriers, maybe an effective navy. And so examples of countries that are maybe land powers, Germany and Russia would certainly qualify as land powers. They're surrounded by other chunks of territory that where there are lines of attack. Britain has sort of been historically understood as a sea power, as an island power, because if you're going to attack Britain, it's going to have to come across the channel, and that means that Britain has to control the channel and be able to defeat a invasion force before it lands. Other island powers, the United States is typically considered an island power because the United States does not perceive itself as facing a threat of invasion from the north or from the south, but it does think about its security in terms of the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. France is kind of in the middle. Historically, France has had to contest with Germany to its sort of east and north, and Spain to its south and west, but it's also had to worry about these sort of two coastlines, one exposed to Britain and one exposed to Italy, both of whom are island powers predominantly, and who are building up navies that could potentially project force against France. And so France is kind of stuck in this weird situation, kind of in between both of them. I want to talk a little bit about how to take some of these ideas about geography and maybe build them up into a much larger story about how this influences threat perception and global alliance patterns. And to do that, I'm going to rehash an argument that was made by a guy named Mackinder back in, I think, 1901, 1905, turn of the 19th, end of the 20th century. He gave a speech at a geography convention. I think he was the president of the American Geographic Society. And in his speech, he kind of talked about how to think about geopolitics from the perspective of the physical geography of the planet. And he began with the story with noting that powerful countries need a resource base to sustain that. And there's really only two ways that you can, expand the resource base that you have available. Historically, that was done by just conquering more territory or by colonizing other areas. That's been less common, I would say, it's in the post-World War II era, but that certainly historically was the pattern that people used. The other pattern that you have is by improving your ability to extract resources from the territory that you have. And so he talks a lot about how railroads were just this revolutionary technology that allowed for transport of goods that were produced in sort of the hinterland of large countries to sort of the population centers on the coast, and allowed to sort of mobilize those resources. irrigation, desalination, other kinds of technologies similarly can increase what countries can get and do with the limited resources that they do have. And this becomes important for Mackinder's story as he sort of thinks about how to divide up the world. And he divides it up in sort of the following way. So he notes that Europe is really just this big peninsula that's very fertile and very prosperous, that kind of juts off of the Eurasian continent. And then there's the Middle East, which is characterized by being less fertile, more arid, more desert, and as a result has a much smaller population than Europe in terms of square mile per square mile. India is sort of this big fertile peninsula that sort of is off sort of the south of the Eurasian continent, but it's cut off largely by mountains, and so it's kind of separated somewhat. And then you have China, which is this large fertile region that's also cut off from the Eurasian continent by desert and by mountains. And then you have Central Asia, which Mackinder calls the pivot. And we'll talk about why that is in a second. But Central Asia is just really this massive grassland upon which it's hard to move, and so you get nomadic peoples who have sort of inherent offensive capability because of just the hugeness of the space, but also their ability to mobilize large, highly mobile forces. Then he notes that sort of in the Western Hemisphere, we have the Americas, which are smaller in terms of landmass than what we see in the Eastern Hemisphere, and therefore just can't provide a comparable amount of resources. They're also cut off from the Eastern Hemisphere by the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Likewise, Australia is kind of off, hanging out by itself, cut off by oceans. And even sub-Saharan Africa, which is land-wise very connectable to the rest of the Eurasian landmass, the Sahara Desert functions essentially as a sand ocean, kind of cutting off sub-Saharan Africa, where there is a sizable population, from kind of the rest of the Eurasian continent. And so one way to kind of visualize this is to pull up this image of sort of the Earth at night, or I guess the Eastern Hemisphere at night, and you can kind of see what Mackinder's getting at, right? You can see the large, fertile, populous area that's sort of jutting off in terms of Asia. You can see India, you can see China, you can kind of see that sort of black empty space of the Sahara Desert kind of cutting off the southern cone of Africa from the Eurasian landmass. The other thing that kind of pops out to me when I look at this picture is this line of lights that's sort of crossing the sort of north of Asia. That's the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And Mackinder would talk about this as essentially this technology that allows for Russia to pull all the resources of the Russian territory and funnel them out in a productive way. And before the Trans-Siberian Railroad existed, there wasn't that mechanism to extract those resources. Okay, so what do we do with this? Dividing up the world, thinking about it in terms of these different regions, how does that help us to think about geopolitics? And Mackinder's argument was that all of sort of human history has been, that seems very totalizing and all-encompassing, but actually I think it's not all that wrong. I mean, we'd say that human history has been significantly driven by the fact that Central Asia, which he calls the pivot, is the only region on Earth that historically has been able to reach multiple other regions, right? The Americas are cut off, Australia is cut off, sub-Saharan Africa is cut off. Even Europe struggles to be able to reach China or India, but the pivot, Central Asia, can access 4 different regions and can potentially extract resources and tribute from those 4 different regions. And so we could think about the Mongol Empire and its invasions into Europe and into India and into China as sort of the fulfillment of this idea of the pivot, of this powerful Central Asian power that is able to leverage both the size of Central Asia and its ability to dominate these different regions to create a vast Eurasian empire, drawing tributes and drawing resources from the whole of the continent. And transportation systems kind of upended that historical story. And Mackinder says that initially, each of these regions was separate, but with the development of ocean navigable, ships, and the ability of folks in Europe to be able to get out from Europe to reach the Americas, to be able to get out from Europe to be able to reach sub-Saharan Africa and Australia and India and China, suddenly the West was able to extract resources in a variety of different mechanisms, through trade, through colonialism, through all sorts of things, but was able to gain power and wealth relative to the pivot, relative to Central Asia. And that story dominated sort of the 400 years from 1400 or from 1500 to Mackinder's time. But Mackinder's looking at this and saying, now that we have railroads, and now that Russia's completing the Trans-Siberian Railroad, this story may be shifting again. That now Russia is able to extract wealth and resources from this whole vast territory that it never would have been able to before, and is going to be able to mobilize those resources in a way that European states were able to mobilize resources. And we may be seeing a shift in terms of the balance of power in the global system because of how technology and geography are interacting. And Mackinder ends up making a prediction about what the 20th century is going to look like, which is really a provocative story. He argues that the pivot, which in his time would have been Russia, but I think later became sort of the Soviet Union, is going to be a threat naturally to all of the other regions of the Eurasian landmass. It's going to be able to push into and try to dominate those various different regions, who are going to fear and try to resist the influence of the Soviet Union, the influence of the pivot. And they're going to find natural allies in what Mackinder calls the outer or insular crescents, these other chunks of the Earth that are not geographically connected to Eurasia, but fear that the pivot might come to dominate the whole of the Eurasian continent, and will form alliances to support those regions that are threatened by the dominance of the pivot. And so he's predicting, in 1905, essentially a conflict between the Soviet Union, which doesn't yet exist, trying to take over Europe, trying to dominate China, trying to push out globally, versus an alliance including the United States, Britain, countries in Western Europe, as well as the United States and Japan and Australia, and even states in maybe sub-Saharan Africa. He's essentially predicting the alliance patterns that will end up becoming realized during the Cold War as the United States implements this policy of containment to essentially stop the advancement of the Soviet Union out from Central Asia. And so one of the things I think is interesting about the story that Mackinder tells is that it's not a story at all about the legacy of World War II and that poisoning the well between the United States and the Soviet Union. It's not a story about capitalism versus communism driving the Cold War. It's a story about geography, that it was sort of baked into the cake that a powerful Soviet Union would threaten these various different regions, and they would seek help and seek alliance and find help and alliance from countries who are sort of geographically separated from the Eurasian landmass, predicting sort of the course and trajectory of the 20th century. The other thing that's provocative about that is that story hasn't changed. That I think it's a little bit extreme to say geography is destiny, but I think Mackinder would point to this and say there's something deep and fundamental that's sort of built into the story about the Eurasian landmass that's going to persist throughout human history going forward, because of how different regions are cut off or have access to each other given mountains and deserts and oceans. that are going to continue to create tension between Russia or whatever country holds that territory and different regions of the Eurasian continent.